Hi, I'm Dave Karger. Welcome back to TCM and the second night of our Trans Images in Film series. I'm very happy to be back with Caden Mark Gardner, the co-author of the book Corpses, Fools, and Monsters. Caden, thanks so much for sticking with me tonight.
Thank you for having me on.
We're jumping about 2 decades ahead from Dog Day Afternoon to talk about a film that I remember seeing when it came out in 1997, Ma Vie en Rose. And I'm thrilled that we're talking about it tonight. This is a Franco-Belgian film about a 7-year-old named Ludo, a boy who insists that he's a girl. And it's a fascinating film because you look at the issue of transgender people from the prism of this almost fairy tale story. What do you find fascinating about this film?
Yeah, early on in our book process, I know that was a film that had come up, and I actually first watched it on TCM. And I definitely was drawn to the sort of fairy tale, magical realist aspect, but also at the heart of it is a very sort of social realist situation where there's the family unit that is reacting to this and also the town reacting to it. How does society react to the notion of a trans child, or at least a child playing with their gender identity?
Yeah.
And this was actually one of the first films we actually screened when we were touring our book. And it definitely still felt incredibly prescient to the current moment.
Obviously, there's the kind of double meaning of the title, which translates to My Life in Pink. Of course, Ludo, the character, likes wearing pink dresses, but also, of course, there's a play on La Vie en Rose, the Edith Piaf song.
Yeah.
What I think is so fascinating is that there's these kind of benign gender stereotypes that all the adults surrounding Ludo are kind of foisting upon this child. And I think one person even says, oh no, by the age of 7, we say you're handsome, and these different terminologies and adjectives and words that are used, and people don't even realize the damage that they're causing.
Yeah, again, the first image we actually have of Ludo is a very sort of striking image of them in feminine dress, feminine clothing. When the character is stripped of that, it's almost like their soul kind of evaporates, and it builds and builds with this sort of negative insistence on them following the sort of gendered stereotypes and binary, if you will. The family faces fallout from it, as well as the character, and the onus is placed on that child. And obviously, an incredibly unfair situation to be put in as a result.
Well, what you realize throughout this movie is that this child has very real feelings, but they have a hard time articulating them because this is a 7-year-old child. This child is not trying to cause any problems. They're just living their life in the way that they best know how to.
Yeah, exactly. It's what would be characterized as just a social transition, if that. And even so, it can just be playing with their identity and trying to figure out what works for them at that time, which can change over time, can do many things. It doesn't even have to just be a trans situation, but we kind of see how that can still cause this very outsized reaction to it, with something that can be so simple, so innocent. The film is, while again is very social realist, it does have this sort of levity instilled, and I think that is due in part to Chris van der Stappen, who co-wrote the film and would identify as butch transmasculine, and actually was credited as sort of coming up with the scenario, and took from their own childhood and even enlisted a sort of tomboy character named Chris in the film, which is kind of a wink and a sort of acknowledgement that even beyond Ludo's character, there are other characters here who have very different degrees of acceptance within their family and within society as well.
It's such a great film. The director is Alan Berliner. I'm really glad that we're showing it tonight. I hope people like it as much as you and I do. Let's watch it, and then we'll talk a little bit more after. From 1997, here is the Golden Globe winner that year for Best Foreign Language Film, Ma Vie en Rose. And I'm back with Caden Mark Gardner to talk a little bit more about this beautiful film, Ma Vie en Rose. One of the other things I love about it is that all children at the age of 7 have rich imaginations. It's the time of magical thinking, as child psychologists like to say. So to see that kind of imparted onto this subject matter, I just think is beautiful and really fascinating.
Yeah, it can go in many different directions for what this character does next later on. It's just, again, they should be allowed and they should be in a loving home in that case. But there's this sort of saying for trans people, we were all children once, essentially. And how, when doing my research for the book, a common thing was looking at trans memoirs, whether it was Christine Jorgensen, whether it was Alicia Brevard, the actress, or it was Jan Morris, the great travel writer, is they did always circle back to this was something that occurred to them in childhood. It's just, again, they did not have the words or the reference points beyond the fact that this was something they felt and it was something they almost had to keep very near to their hearts, essentially.
You mentioned before the movie that this was a film that you've screened as part of the book tour for Corpses, Fools, and Monsters. How do you think this movie plays 28 years later?
I do think it is very prescient to the fact that there is, for lack of a better word, political firestorm, even though, again, I would say, much like society back in the 90s, which this film takes place, that there is a very sort of disincentive for a child to basically be like Ludo, essentially. And we have seen that in many cases, some families do have to uproot, like the family does in this movie. And it definitely does strike as prescient. And even though, again, I would say there are ways and outlets for children in this situation to reach out to, there is also, again, the threat of backlash. And I think that was very understood when screening this film.
I'd be curious to know, in the research that you and Willow did for this book, did you encounter other films that talk about trans children, or is this an outlier?
It's very much something that I think, due to the sort of nature of where it was ripped from the headline, sort of tabloid subject matter, that trans subject matter was often immediately kind of branded as exploitation, put into adult material section. A lot of trans memoirs, even though, again, they were just very sort of basic life stories, were sort of put in adult bookstores, essentially. So it is an outlier in the fact that it does feel often like this sort of taboo subject matter, even though in many cases trans memoirs do present this sort of childhood aspect and childhood knowing that this is something that is often portrayed as something that is done in adulthood.
Well, I think because it's handled with such sensitivity on the part of the filmmakers and the entire cast,
Absolutely.
I think it's really well worth seeing. Caden, thank you so much for being here with me all night. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me again.
Okay, that's it for me and Caden, but stick around because I'll be back with a biographical drama from 1970 about one of the first well-known trans people, Christine Jorgensen. Stick around.
Next on TCM, the Christine Jorgensen story. Then Paris is burning, and later Dressed in Blue. TCM colors Outside the Lines tonight.